The cuffs tightened as Officer Rick Halper snarled in the middle of the courthouse hallway. "Marine sniper, to me you're just black trash in an orange jumpsuit." Naomi Carter clenched her teeth blood at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes remained fierce. "I once defended the flag you're now dragging through the dirt with your mouth." The crowd fell silent, a few sneering laughs echoing like accomplices, turning justice into a joke. Rick struck her hard. The sharp crack rang out beneath the cold high ceiling. "In here, I am the law." At that moment, the heavy door swung open, and a voice cut through the silence, each word like a blade. "Who gave you the right to humiliate my soldier?" Morning in the city detention camp opened under a heavy gray sky. Clouds, thick above the light, filtering through the bars, dull and cold. The metallic clink echoed down the hallway as handcuffs locked tight around Naomi Carter's wrist. The woman, who was once a famed Marine sniper, now wore a worn-out orange jumpsuit, walking slowly but with her back straight. With every step she took, the chain dangling from her wrist swayed the metal, striking the wall, emphasizing the starkness of her situation. Other inmates sat silently in the corners of the cells. A few curious glances followed her, but no one dared to speak. The air was thick with mildew and rusted iron, a suffocating atmosphere where people were reduced to meaningless numbers. Officer Rick Halper, broad-faced with a chin rough from a rushed shave, yanked the cuffs hard as if trying to leave a mark on Naomi's skin. He smirked, voice thick with mockery, spitting out each word like a blade. "A sniper, huh? To me, you're just a number now, a rotten name in the inmate log. Those medals of yours, I'll count them like stains." The words bounced off the narrow walls, triggering low chuckles at the end of the hall. A few nearby guards laughed too loud on purpose so Naomi could hear, as if their only joy came from trampling on the glory of someone once respected. Naomi didn't reply. Her lips were pressed so tight, a pale line formed at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes lit with contempt. Those eyes had once been her tool in brutal battles, peering through a scope, seeing both the enemy and her team's survival. Today, they were sharp again, a quiet blade reflecting back a contempt that made Rick uneasy for a brief second. But he quickly crushed the feeling, yanked the chain again, and muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Give me that look again, and you'll find out what the ground tastes like with my boot on your neck." Laughter erupted from a group of guards near the iron door. They didn't miss a chance to mock her. Some whistled, others slapped the bars to make a racket. A skinny man shouted, "Hey, Halper, watch out that girl. Dropped plenty of bodies in the desert. Better not let her stare too long. She might be lining up your forehead in her mind right now." The half-joke stirred more filthy laughter, sounds stretched out on purpose to turn the hallway into a market of jeers. Rick sneered, jerking his chin toward her. "Takes freedom to pull a trigger, and she's got nothing now but cuffs. Marine sniper. She looks more like a chained-up dog." Naomi walked each step, dragged down by the weight of the chain. She took a long breath, not to calm herself, but to resist the stench that clung to everything around her. Images from memory surged back her, moving through sun-scorched hills, rifle heavy on her shoulder eyes, never dropping in the face of danger. Compared to those days, this prison hallway was only a shadow, yet the humiliation they poured on her made it feel entirely different. This was not a battlefield where bullets flew and blood spilled, but a silent hunt where power turned the keyholders into monsters. Rick leaned in, whispering close to her ear, his breath reeking of cigarettes. "You think the name Naomi Carter means anything outside this building out there? The press just calls you that black inmate. No one remembers your so-called heroics." The words cut deep, not because they were true, but because they laid bare the harsh truth of the world outside, a world that forgot its soldiers the moment they fell into the legal system. Naomi didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the steel door at the end of the hallway, as if all that filth in the air could never reach her. The heavy footsteps stopped when Rick slammed her hard against the wall loud enough to make the hallway shudder. She winced slightly, but made no sound. Rick glanced around, then lowered his voice, still biting off every word. Don't expect a chance to prove yourself in court. To me, you've got one role to be the clown everyone laughs at." Then he shoved her forward again, the sound of dragging chains dry and sharp like a soundtrack to a morning soaked in disgrace. Across the hall, a few inmates pressed close to the bars watching Naomi, not just with curiosity, but with something like pity, maybe even vague encouragement. An older black woman mumbled through the bars, "Keep going, baby. Don't let them see you fall." Naomi tilted her head slightly, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes, but quickly turned forward her sword again. She knew every gesture could be twisted into another excuse for the guards to mock her. The final door opened, and a cold gust swept in, carrying the thick stench of metal and sweat. As Naomi stepped through that threshold, she knew she was no longer in the shadows of the holding cell, but what waited ahead was not freedom, it was just another curtain of contempt. Rick tightened the cuffs one last time, looked her in the eye and smirked. "Get ready. Today the whole court's gonna see you not as a soldier, but as a clown in this justice circus." Naomi raised her head, eyes sharp as blades. Saying nothing, but her silence made the air around her thicken, as if the strongest response was refusing to be dragged down to the level of those mocking her. For a brief second, Rick looked away from her gaze, but quickly masked it with another crooked grin. The narrow hallway stretched longer than ever, each step pulling Naomi into a different kind of battle. A battle with no bullets, but full of invisible weapons, words, stares, complicit silence. In the iron shadow of that bleak morning, Naomi Carter walked forward as if she already knew this was only the beginning of a long stretch facing the lash of power. The courthouse hallway that morning was packed, the wooden benches lining the walls, filled with lawyers, court staff, reporters, and a few civilians attending minor hearings. Light from the tall glass windows slanted down onto the stained tile floor, casting pale streaks across the ground. The already quiet atmosphere grew dense the moment the iron door opened, and Naomi Carter was pushed out, hands cuffed tightly behind her back with gleaming metal. The clinking of chains echoed sharply immediately, drawing every gaze in the room. The woman in the orange prison uniform moved through the crowd like a red ink stain on white paper, unmistakable and impossible to ignore. Officer Rick Halper followed close behind his rough hand, pressing down on Naomi's shoulder, shoving her forward so she stumbled, then was forced into motion again. He made sure to raise his voice, letting it ring down the hallway. This is the great soldier America produced, a legendary sniper. She looks like trash scraped from the bottom of the barrel. The sound bounced off the walls, cutting through the silence and landing in every ear. A few people turned suddenly, eyes flickering, then quickly looked away, stepping aside as if Naomi's presence were a threat best avoided. The clatter of high heels echoed as a few female clerks hurried off, their movements tight with worry and haste. Some young lawyers clutching stacks of files paused briefly, eyes flicking toward Naomi before darting away again as if eye contact alone might implicate them. A boy walking with his mother whispered a question, but she pulled him along immediately, her hand gripping his tighter, shielding him from an invisible danger. No one wanted to confront the truth in front of them because that truth stirred up too much, so they would rather pretend not to see. Naomi walked slowly, shoulders held straight, eyes lowered to the cold tiles. Through the thick silence, her voice rose, soft but clear, every word precise. "My honor cannot be chained." It wasn't loud and it didn't shake, but it cut like a sharp blade through the air, cold and direct. Those standing nearby flinched slightly. They heard it, but pretended they didn't because they knew that to nod in agreement meant inviting the spotlight onto themselves. Rick scoffed, leaned in and spat out his words with venom. "Arrogant bitch. Still think you matter even in cuffs. You're not a warrior, you're an inmate, and inmates should know when to shut up." He made sure to speak loudly, drawing out every word like a whip slicing the air, forcing everyone in the hallway to hear. A few chuckles from the on-duty officers at the far end of the corridor rang out, piling on the shame already being heaped on Naomi. She lifted her head, her eyes no longer looking away. For a brief moment, light from the window caught them, making them flash with a hardened stare. Rick saw it, but turned away, pretending not to notice, then pressed firmly on Naomi's shoulder, guiding her deeper into the hallway. People stepped aside, leaving a path as if for someone headed to execution, and Naomi walked through it with the sound of dragging chains scraping against the tile ringing out like a mocking tune. Near the stairwell, a young reporter adjusted his camera, accidentally pointing the lens toward Naomi. Rick spotted it instantly and barked, "Put the camera down. There's nothing here worth shooting." The reporter froze quickly, lowering the camera, his face clearly rattled. Naomi caught the moment, a flicker of disappointment passing through her eyes. She knew that even when truth stared people in the face, hundreds would still choose to look away, letting injustice pile on unchecked. Rick kept talking loudly, not just at Naomi, but for the whole hallway to hear, asserting his control. "Let this be a lesson, all of you. Don't ever think that wearing a uniform puts you above the law. Once you're in that defendant's chair, soldier or hero, you're just scum." His words landed like a verdict, pleased with turning Naomi from a symbol into a spectacle. Naomi stayed silent, not out of defeat, but as if building a cold wall against every insult thrown her way. Each step she took, though heavy, remained steady. No trembling, no collapse. In the face of mocking laughter and averted gazes, her posture was the last fragment of dignity left. The hallway stretched endlessly, every footstep a blade slicing at her pride, yet she kept walking, needing to prove to herself that even in chains no one could strip the warrior spirit from within her. Rick watched that stubborn figure, and it bothered him more than any outburst would have. He leaned in, voice sharp as poison, hissing, "You'll see. That so-called honor will be crushed in court. Today I'm making you the city's laughingstock." Naomi didn't respond. She simply turned and locked eyes with him. That look sparked a flicker of unease in Rick, but he quickly shoved it down and forced her forward toward the courtroom door. The chains clinked with each step, each sound etching itself into the thick atmosphere. People in the hallway kept their distance, silent, as if silence itself could shield them from being dragged in. But they didn't realize that silence was the real shackle tighter than the metal around Naomi's wrists. And in that corridor of humiliation, injustice stood plainly visible, while everyone pretended not to see, letting a human being be trampled right before their eyes. The courtroom door opened, and the neon lights hanging overhead cast a harsh, cold, blinding white glow. The air inside was thick like an invisible wall, pressing against the chest, making every step inside feel heavier. The old wooden benches creaked as the audience shifted, all eyes turning toward Naomi Carter being escorted in. She was led to the front and seated in the witness chair, while Officer Rick Halper stood beside her, chin raised with arrogant pride, as if he were the one holding all the power in the room. Above them, Judge Wallace sat, motionless, eyes cold behind round glasses, fingers tapping slowly on the wooden bench, his gaze more like someone observing an object than a living human being. The prosecutor adjusted a thick folder of documents, his voice steady and deliberate as it echoed through the room, each word intentionally emphasized the defendant, or more accurately, prisoner. Naomi Carter is charged with public disorder, violent conduct, and resisting a law enforcement officer. His stress on the word prisoner added another layer of coldness to the room. No one mentioned sergeant. No one remembered the decades of service. No one spoke of battlefield scars. Everything had been flattened into a single label: inmate. The words fell like heavy stones, bearing everything she once was. Naomi sat still, back straight, eyes fixed on the tile floor, absorbing every word being thrown at her. She knew well that in this atmosphere, every statement from the prosecutor was more than language. It was a predetermined sentence. But her silence was not weakness. It was her effort to hold back any reaction that could be used against her. Every breath, every movement of her hand resting on her thigh was tense, as if the slightest misstep could be seized and crushed. As the prosecutor continued his monologue, Rick Halper suddenly cut in his voice, thick with hostility. "She can't even speak properly. All black folks are like that, mumbling through their words, saying things nobody can understand. The words shot out like fire, tearing through the courtroom's tense silence. A few murmurs rose from the back benches, followed by stifled, spiteful laughter. Judge Wallace glanced down briefly, lips pressed tight, but said nothing, offering no correction, no reprimand for Rick's outburst. The courtroom accepted it in silence, as if it were normal, a routine indulgence, long left unchecked. Naomi lifted her head, lips pressed tight, eyes fixed straight ahead, keeping her posture steady. But beneath the table, her hand curled inward, fingers trembling as they clenched into a fist. The shaking wasn't from fear, but from rage, held in from the helplessness of having to listen to filth being spoken in a place where justice was supposed to reside. Every vein in her hand swelled with tension, but she held it back, knowing that even the slightest outburst would be turned into evidence against her. The prosecutor cleared his throat softly as if to regain control of the room, though his eyes flickered with a hint of shared amusement toward Rick. He resumed in a formal tone, yet each word carried an undercurrent of mockery. "Naomi Carter, are you aware that resisting a law enforcement officer is a serious offense, especially given your current criminal record?" The word record was stretched out like a hammer slamming down on what little honor remained. Naomi inhaled slowly, eyes settling on a crack in the tile beneath her feet, then calmly replied, "I know the law, and I know I didn't resist anyone." Her voice was low, firm, each word cutting through the air. But her answer was quickly swallowed by Rick's sneering laugh. He stepped forward louder than the prosecutor. "Now the law? What the hell would someone like you know about the law? You're in cuffs for refusing orders. That's called resisting. She still thinks she's a soldier, still thinks she can give commands. That's hilarious." He turned toward the crowd, inviting them into his performance of humiliation. And sadly, a few nods followed, a few curled lips of agreement, as if they were hypnotized by the authority of his uniform instead of the truth in front of them. Naomi bit her lip, holding back any reaction. She knew that if her anger broke free now, everything she had endured would be wasted. Instead, she only tightened her grip, her nails digging into her palms until it hurt. Her silence to Rick seemed like provocation. He leaned in close to her ear, lowering his voice, but still loud enough for a few nearby to hear. "You can stay quiet, but I'll turn that silence into proof that you have nothing to say. A mute inmate, that's who you really are." The room fell silent, broken only by the scratch of pens and the hurried rustle of paper. Judge Wallace remained seated, his gaze like solid ice unmoved. No rebuke, no gavel strike to intervene, no voice raised in defense. The air was so stifling that each breath felt like it pierced Naomi's chest. She looked up toward the high bench, locking eyes with that cold stare for a single instant. Just one fleeting moment, but it was enough to tell her justice did not live here only. Silent, complicit indifference. Naomi swallowed dryly, sitting motionless, but inside HR, a slow fire burned. She knew that even if they tried to turn her into a joke, something far greater still waited ahead. Truth never disappeared just because a room was full of bowed heads. And it was that belief that kept her sitting upright, eyes steady, even as the hand beneath the table trembled over and over as if ready to shatter. The sharp crack of the gavel rang out, and Judge Wallace tilted his chin, signaling the prosecutor to proceed. The salt and pepper-haired attorney stood stacked his files in front of him and spoke in a steady voice laced with deliberate emphasis. He began with questions that seemed simple on the surface, but each one was twisted just enough to force Naomi Carter into repeating herself. "You confirm that you were present at the scene that day?" He asked, eyes on his papers, but his tone more suited to interrogating a liar. Naomi answered plainly. "Yes." The attorney nodded, then followed up immediately. "Yes means what? Can you elaborate? Where were you standing? How far? What did you see first?" Each question followed the next without pause. Naomi tried to stay composed, replying with more detail. "I was near the gate about 10 paces away, and I saw two people arguing. But the attorney pressed further, unsatisfied. 10 paces. Are your steps long or short? How did you measure that? Are you sure you're not mistaken about the distance? The crowd shifted slightly, whispers dying down as tension thickened. Naomi gently squeezed her cuffed hands resting on her lap and answered evenly. I'm a sniper. Distance is something I've never gotten wrong. A short response, but it sparked a low ripple of murmurs. From the back, half admiration, half sarcasm. Rick Halper seized the moment, stepping forward with a sneer, cutting in. Hear that? She calls herself a sniper, but I bet she can't even speak English properly. Always fumbling with words, probably used to that filthy barracks slang. He gave a dry laugh, glancing around to make sure everyone heard. A few in the audience chuckled along, some nodding slightly, as if in agreement. Judge Wallace made no move to stop him, his icy gaze fixed downward, offering no interruption, as if Rick's jabs were a permitted part of the process. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment, drew a deep breath, then opened them with a steady gaze. Her voice was slow but clear in the silent room. I understand every word, even when it's wrapped in contempt. I hear the truth and I hear the lies too. The answer rang through the room, not loud but sharp, each word slicing the air like a blade. The crowd fell silent, some lowering their heads, others exchanging glances before quickly looking away. The prosecutor cleared his throat again, momentarily off balance, quickly regained his rhythm, and resumed the line of questioning. Did you see who struck first? Are you sure it wasn't a hallucination? Are you certain you weren't biased toward one side? He pushed harder, trying to shake Naomi's footing. She replied firmly. I saw them push each other, then one person fell. I wasn't on anyone's side. I said what my eyes saw. The attorney nodded, but his eyes betrayed disappointment. Naomi's answers refused to walk into the trap he had set. Rick cut in again, his tone sharp and venomous. Her eyes, those same eyes that used to spot targets through a scope. Now she wants to play innocent. He turned toward the back of the room, scanning for support, but this time the room stayed silent. Perhaps Naomi's earlier response, steady and strong, had made some hesitate, but the atmosphere didn't ease. Instead, the silence stretched tight, like a wire ready to snap. Naomi sat upright, her gaze unwavering. She could feel every stare drilling into her, some filled with doubt, others with scorn. Yet there were a few different ones too, glimmers of something like hidden respect. Her hand under the table still trembled, veins rising under the strain of her clenched fist, but her face gave away nothing except resilience. The prosecutor continued with his twisting questions, but now the tone in the room had shifted. Each of Naomi's answers, though brief, carried a quiet strength, making Rick's taunts fall flatter with every word. No one in the room dared to speak against him, but the silence of the crowd now felt like a barrier, and Rick started to sense that his words were echoing into emptiness, no longer met with the easy approval he was used to. Inside the suffocating room, every question, every insult, every cold glance became a psychological strike piling on top of Naomi. Yet through it all, she remained seated like solid stone, enduring the invisible blades cutting into her dignity. And in that breathless silence, it was her unshaken gaze that spoke the loudest, force those who tried to crush her to realize that power alone couldn't always break a person's will. The tension in the courtroom was already suffocating, but when the prosecutor shifted his line of questioning, it became a tightening vice. He was no longer asking to seek the truth, but pushing Naomi Carter into contradicting herself. Who gave the order? Answer or stay silent forever. His voice rang out, sharp and clipped each word, striking like a needle aimed straight at Naomi. The entire room fell silent, everyone waiting, as if even her silence would be treated as guilt. Naomi took a deep breath, keeping it steady. She knew every word she said could be twisted, but the truth still had to be spoken. Her voice came low and clear, not loud but heavy with weight. I'm not making false claims. I'm speaking the truth. Those words landed like an oath and also like a thorn in the eyes of those trying to bury her. Rick Halper, standing nearby, suddenly lunged forward as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. In a flash, his rough hand struck Naomi hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed against the 4 courtroom walls, freezing the room. It wasn't just a slap, it was a gavel slamming down a declaration that law here belonged to the uniform, not to justice. Rick barked out shouting right after the blow truth. The truth is you're worthless. Naomi toppled sideways, the wooden chair screeching as it scraped against the tile. Blood welled at the corner of her mouth, a bright red line against her dark skin. Her eyes wavered, but she didn't cry out, didn't beg, didn't flinch, only silence making the moment more chilling. The crowd behind her collectively held its breath, many wide-eyed in shock, but not one person stood. No one objected. No one spoke. Once again, complicit silence flooded the room, burying the violence that had just exploded in plain sight. Judge Wallace, seated high above, kept his eyes on the thick file in front of him. He flipped through a few pages, eyes never lifting from the text, as if nothing at all had occurred. The gavel didn't fall. His voice didn't rise. The courtroom had just witnessed blatant violence, yet the one in highest authority chose silence, treating it like a detail unworthy of being recorded. Naomi slowly straightened herself, a trembling hand bracing against the edge of the chair for balance. Blood ran from her lip to her chin, staining the old orange prison uniform. Her eyes blinked once, not allowing a single tear to fall. Her gaze held steady, quiet, but defiant, a sharp flame burning through the moment she was struck down. Rick saw it, and it only enraged him more. But even he could sense that something had just slipped beyond his control. In the gallery, a few women covered their mouths. A few men frowned, but all remained seated. Confusion mixed with fear led them to bow their heads. One reporter raised a camera, then hesitated, his hand stalling before setting it back on his thigh, eyes turning away. In this crowded courtroom, Naomi was still alone, and Rick's slap wasn't just an act of violence, it was a warning to anyone who might think of defending her. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, but Naomi didn't lower her head. She sat upright, eyes not seeking sympathy, but reminding herself of the value she once carried through every day on the battlefield. The physical pain was real, but the deeper pain cut sharper. Truth twisted, justice trampled, and a room full of witnesses choosing silence. Rick stepped back, arms folded, still wearing a smug expression, though a flicker of unease crossed his eyes. He felt it. The slap hadn't brought him the satisfaction he expected. Naomi's silence, the steady look in her eyes, struck back harder than a fist could have. It didn't hit his face, but reached deep into the arrogance he wore like armor. Still, he believed he held the power in this moment, still convinced no one would dare challenge him. The room fell into a heavy stillness, broken only by the clerk's pen scratching slowly, unsteadily, as if even the record itself felt the weight of what had just happened. Judge Wallace remained hunched over, fingers shifting as if to turn another page, then pausing halfway. That moment stretched on long enough for everyone to feel it an undercurrent waiting to erupt. Naomi slowly reached up to wipe the blood away with the back of her hand, then placed it calmly on her lap again. A simple motion, but in that setting it stood like a silent declaration she would not let a slap break her. Her eyes swept across the room, catching every face that looked away, every lowered gaze, every trembling shoulder under the pressure. And in that look there was pain, but also resolve that one day truth would be spoken, no matter how deep the silence now covering this room. In a moment, when no one dared to speak, an invisible chill seemed to pass through, carrying a breath of something ominous. It signaled a shift, the storm drawing near. That blow didn't just draw blood from Naomi's lip, it tore through the thin veil masking what this courtroom called justice. And even as Judge Wallace stayed silent, even as the prosecutor looked away, even as the crowd held its breath, everyone could feel it. The fragile order was cracking. That slap, instead of silencing a voice, lit the fuse, setting off a turning point no one would be able to stop. The air in the courtroom was stretched tight like a string about to snap. The prosecutor's barrage of questions, Rick's venomous remarks, and Judge Wallace's cold silence closed in around Naomi Carter like a net. Sweat gathered on her temple, her hand under the table clenched so tight her nails dug into her skin. She held her head high, but her breath was labored, a creeping sense of helplessness spreading because here every word she spoke was twisted, every glance cast down only to judge. The crowd's stillness made the atmosphere even heavier, as if the whole room were waiting for the moment Naomi would be crushed completely. At that exact moment, the heavy wooden door at the back of the room burst open with a sharp crack that rang out like a bell. Every head turned, and in that instant the air split open. A tall figure in full military uniform stepped in each stride, hitting the floor with precision, his boots echoing with cold authority. All noise vanished, even the whispers swallowed into silence, leaving only an eerie pause. The man was none other than General Thomas Grant, the four-star general whose name was spoken with reverence across the military world. He didn't look at anyone, didn't nod, didn't ask permission. He moved forward like an unstoppable current heading straight toward the witness chair where Naomi sat. His eyes were sharp, his face unreadable, but the force in his walk and his presence were enough to make the room hold its breath. Some people in the gallery stood instinctively, others bowed their heads slightly, as if afraid that his gaze might land on them and demand they confront themselves. Naomi flinched, her eyes briefly widening at the familiar silhouette. Everything inside her seemed to freeze, uncertain if what she saw was real or some hallucination born of pressure. But General Grant gave her no time to wonder. He walked directly to her, stopped in front of her, and bent down to unfasten the steel cuffs biting into her wrists. The metallic click of the release rang clear, louder than any accusation uttered moments earlier. His eyes locked on hers, and his voice came low and steady, each word heavy and final. "No one has the right to lay a hand on my soldier." The courtroom fell into absolute stillness. Dozens of eyes locked on them, not a sound, not even a breath dared to rise. Judge Wallace sat above his hand, holding the gavel frozen midair, his eyes flickering with a rare trace of hesitation. The prosecutor halted, mouth open, but unable to speak. Porters at the back of the room sat stunned, some reaching for their cameras, but stopping themselves, too unsure to risk being noticed at a time like this. Rick Halper turned pale instinctively, stepping back, eyes wide as he stared at General Grant. The usual arrogance drained from his face, lips moving without sound. In that moment, all the false authority he had flaunted collapsed, exposing how small he was when faced with someone who held real power. The general's cold gaze swept across him, and sweat broke out along Rick's spine. Naomi sat still, her wrists freshly freed from the cuffs, still marked by red welts, her heart pounding. The general's words echoed in her mind like a powerful antidote, dissolving the isolation that had wrapped around her. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. Just a strange, quiet brightness stirred by emotion and long-buried pride. General Grant straightened, turned to face the entire courtroom, and spoke with a voice that rang through the space, not loud but clear enough for every ear. "Today, you are not just judging one person. You're insulting every man and woman who has ever worn this uniform. You may call her a prisoner, but to me and to those who've fought beside her, Naomi Carter is and will always be a soldier." He didn't shout, but each word landed like a hammer, shaking the room to its core. Rick tried to steady himself, took a breath, and forced a brittle response. "General, this is a courtroom, not a barracks. In here, she's a defendant, not a soldier." But his voice trembled, lacking its usual certainty. The general turned to him, his gaze sharp as a blade. "You just struck a soldier in the middle of a courtroom in front of a judge and the public. Don't delude yourself into thinking you are the law because the law does not permit thuggery." Rick backed up another half step, his face drained a color, throat tight, unable to respond. Silence stretched long enough to catch the sound of a pen dropping from the clerk's bench. Judge Wallace struck his gavel once, but the sound wasn't strong enough to shift the mood. The four-star general stood firm like an immovable monument, making all the courtroom's legal language feel fragile. The spectators exchanged glances, no one daring to speak because they all knew the tide had turned, the weight had shifted toward the truth that had long been suppressed. Naomi exhaled deeply, her hand brushing over the marks on her wrist, eyes fixed on the general. In the moment he removed her cuffs, all the humiliation from the hearing until now seemed to dissolve. She was no longer alone, no longer the prey backed into a corner. Her heart beat fast but steady because in that moment in the general's eyes she had rediscovered the self she once took pride in. Rick turned to Judge Wallace, his voice uneven. You can't let a military officer interfere in a courtroom like this." Judge Wallace didn't respond right away. He looked straight down, but the icy indifference in his eyes was gone. In its place was hesitation, as if even he had been shaken by the general's word. The room tilted, the order so tightly held since the beginning now cracking, revealing a harsh truth. The one in chains wasn't the most disgraceful person in the room. General Grant turned quietly to Naomi, offering a slight nod as a silent affirmation. Naomi met his gaze with steadiness, feeling the weight of the chains just removed, pressing not only from her wrist but lifting from her chest. She saw it clearly now. The truth would speak, and the moment that door had burst open was the beginning of it. The courtroom remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of complicity. It was a silence subdued by real authority. Everything felt frozen, save for the pounding hearts of those facing a moment in history. And in that stillness, Naomi Carter knew her battle wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. The courtroom was dead silent, the sound of the metal cuffs hitting the floor still echoing. All eyes turned toward General Thomas Grant, who had stepped from the spectator's seat straight into the center of the courtroom, as if he were the eye of the storm now swirling through the room. He stood tall, his frame solid like steel, his cold eyes fixed on Rick Halper. In that moment, the air seemed locked in place, every breath held tight as everyone sensed an inevitable reckoning was about to unfold. The general turned, lifting his strong arm, pointing a firm finger directly at Rick's face. His voice dropped low, each word deliberate, cutting through the room. "You just struck a United States Marine who once protected my life. Now explain your actions before this entire court." The words thundered through the silence. Each syllable landed like a command, not a question. People froze their eyes, darting from the four-star general to the trembling officer, then back again, waiting for what would come next. Rick, long used to being the one in control, suddenly found himself the one under fire. He stepped back, face pale, sweat beading on his temple. His mouth opened, a stammering voice faltering. She was being disruptive. But before he could finish the clumsy excuse, the general cut in, voice sharp as a blade. "You just insulted the entire United States Armed Forces." That statement struck the walls and bounced back like a verdict no one could deny. A wave of murmurs surged through the gallery. Some covered their mouths, others widened their eyes in disbelief. Phones that had been hidden were now being quietly raised, cameras glinting under the neon lights, all pointed toward the confrontation. Everyone understood that this was no longer just a courtroom hearing. It had become a historical moment where false authority clashed directly with real command. Naomi sat behind them, wrists still marked from the chains, eyes locked on the general. Her heart pounded not from fear, but from emotion, because what had just been said wasn't only a defense of her, it was a declaration of honor for every soldier who had ever sacrificed. She felt the weight of those words like a suit of armor washing away the humiliation that had buried her minutes before. Rick, meanwhile, looked around in panic, eyes searching for help from Judge Wallace, but all he met was the judge's cold silence. Though his face remained blank, Wallace's hand, holding the gavel, trembled slightly, betraying his shaken composure. The crowd noticed, and as they watched that subtle falter, their anticipation rose. The man, once above them, no longer seemed to command the room. Rick swallowed hard, trying to raise his voice to reclaim control. "You can't interfere like this, sir. This is a civilian courtroom. She's a prisoner. I was following protocol." But the general cut him off instantly, not allowing him to finish protocol. What protocol permits you to strike a cuffed witness? What protocol allows you to use racial slurs to humiliate someone who once wore the uniform to defend this nation? You didn't just disgrace her, you disgraced the flag on my shoulder. His words pounded like a hammer, each sentence carrying the weight of a verdict. Rick lowered his head, his eyes darting, searching for a way to justify himself, but there was none. In the seats behind, people nodded, a few gasped softly, and several phones buzzed with live streams already being shared across social media. Naomi remained still, dried blood at the edge of her lips, but her eyes glowed, watching the confrontation unfold as if finally spotting a path through despair. To her, this was more than a personal defense, it was the restoration of honor. The general didn't need to raise his voice or provide any evidence. By presence alone, by firm and unshaken words, he had tilted the scales of justice back toward her. The courtroom reeled, thrown off its expected axis. Rick stood frozen, lips pressed tight, hands clasped together, sweat dripping to the floor. He was no longer the man who ruled the hearing with fists, but a small figure exposed under the judgment of hundreds of eyes. The whispers in the gallery grew louder, rising like a tide, sweeping away the silence that once enabled complicity. And at the center of that wave, General Grant stood unmoved, needing no grand speeches, only truth and honor to crush hollow arrogance. In that moment, Naomi knew her fight had taken a new turn. She was no longer alone against the frozen wall of abusive power, because now a voice strong enough had risen to shatter the silence. And that voice, once unleashed, would never be silenced again. The courtroom remained tense, like a steel wire. All eyes locked on the confrontation that had just erupted between General Thomas Grant and Rick Halper. No one moved, no one dared breathe deeply until a small motion from the back row snapped everyone into awareness. A middle-aged woman, modest in appearance, eyes sharp tension, pulled a phone from her bag. Her hand trembled slightly, but she hit record and switched to live stream. The screen reflected Naomi Carter sitting upright, blood at her lip, facing down an entire system of silence, while a four-star general stood in front of her like a shield. That image entered the frame, sharp, complete, soaked in both humiliation and buried pride. The woman raised the phone higher, trying to keep the lens steady. She knew the risk, but she also knew that if she didn't act, the truth would be buried under dry legal paperwork. The soft notification of the stream going live sounded from the device, signaling that hundreds, then thousands, were tuning in. At that moment, Rick Halper noticed. His eyes darkened instantly, jaw tightening. He jerked his chin and stormed forward, his voice harsh and loud across the room. "Turn it off, or you'll share her fate." As his threat echoed, some in the gallery flinched, and a few phones already raised were quickly lowered. The air grew heavier, thickened by a new layer of fear. Naomi turned slightly, catching the woman's eyes. For a moment, two complete strangers shared an unspoken understanding. Naomi didn't speak, but her gaze carried silent gratitude. The woman nodded, gripping the phone tighter, even as Rick approached, his breath hot and hostile behind every word. But before he could reach out, General Grant stepped in, placing himself between Rick and the woman. He turned his broad frame, fully shielding Naomi, and his voice rang out, firm and commanding. Not shouted, but heavy enough to make the room flinch. "Touch her again, and you won't just lose your badge, you'll lose your freedom." The words rang out, tearing through the thick tension, followed by a wave of audible breathing from the crowd. Rick froze his hand midair, unable to move closer. His eyes darted for a moment, his face drained to color, his throat dry. The arrogance that usually wrapped around him was now stripped away, replaced by confusion. Meanwhile, the camera continued to roll, capturing everything: the four-star general standing in the center of the courtroom protecting a female Marine sniper who had been assaulted, confronting a lawman drunk on power. The woman tapped the share button and instantly the video broke through the thick walls of the courtroom. Outside, hundreds waiting for updates received a live notification. The crowd began to cluster, eyes fixed on the screen, where Naomi's face appeared, a streak of dried blood on her lip and defiance in her eyes. Audio rang from mobile speakers replaying General Grant's words. "No one has the right to touch my soldier." Then came the sharp, cold warning: "You won't just lose your badge, you'll lose your freedom." On social media, comments exploded. Messages poured in like a flood. What the hell is happening in that courtroom? A Marine sniper assaulted in front of a judge. Unreal. That man is General Grant. He just stood up for her. The hashtag #justice for Naomi ignited, spreading from dozens to thousands, then hundreds of thousands within the hour. Outrage filled the feed. "I want justice for her. Don't let those who protect our country be humiliated. Violence in court is a disgrace to the law." Outside the courthouse, chants began rising from the crowd. Some held up phones replaying the live stream, raising them for those without access to see. The image of Naomi with blood on her face and pride in her stare became a focal point, an instant symbol of exposed injustice. Rick Halper, in their eyes, was no longer a police officer but a uniformed abuser. General Grant, standing firm, became a banner of resistance. Inside the courtroom, the quiet murmurs had grown into a wave of restless voices. People looked at each other, eyes shifting from fear to awakening. Reporters who had hesitated now boldly raised their cameras' shutters, clicking rapidly to capture every moment. Rick turned to Judge Wallace, seeking intervention, but the judge remained still, his hand clenched around the gavel-eyed, distant face, stern but tense. His silence no longer protected the system, it now exposed its hesitation. Naomi slowly wiped the blood from her lip and lifted her head. She said nothing, but in her eyes burned a new fire, sparked by the unexpected support, by the truth breaking free from the cold walls of the room. She knew what had just happened was now beyond Rick's control, beyond the prosecutors, even beyond Judge Wallace's. The first flame had been lit, and it was about to spread into a roaring storm. Outside, waves of chants, "Justice for Naomi," pounded against the courthouse glass. Officers stationed in the courtyard looked unsettled, some gripping their radios, others staring intently at the growing crowd. Hastily written posters were raised, and a few veterans in the crowd removed their caps, hands over their hearts in a silent pledge. It had all been sparked by a single trembling phone held by a woman willing to face danger. Inside the courtroom, General Grant still stood in front of Naomi, eyes locked on Rick, his voice low but razor sharp. "You should know, from this moment on, it's not just me watching. You've lost the chance to hide. The world is watching now." Rick clenched his fists, fingernails digging into his palms, his face pale. For the first time, the badge on his chest felt like a stone, dragging him under. The video kept spreading, jumping to other platforms, picked up by independent news sites that reposted it with blazing headlines. "Marine sniper assaulted in courtroom, 4-star general confronts cop." Each headline poured fuel on the fire, and the hashtag #justice for Naomi surged with force. What had once been buried inside a courtroom now lit up society, and no one could pretend not to know, not to hear, not to see. And in the cold neon light of that room, Naomi Carter sat tall silently, becoming the center of a movement, just beginning, a flame lit by blood, by silence, and by the moment someone dared to stand against injustice. Within a single night, the live-streamed courtroom video spread at an astonishing speed, its numbers climbing by the hour, overwhelming even the most resilient systems. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of shares, and an endless stream of comments poured in, each one a blade. pointed at how Naomi Carter had been treated. From big cities to small towns and cafes and on street corners, people talked about the image of a female Marine sniper slapped in court blood at her lip while the man who struck her wore a police uniform. Questions echoed everywhere. How can a Marine sniper be treated like a criminal? What kind of justice allows violence inside a courtroom? She served, she protected this country, and this is how we repay her. The outrage spread, turning into a public firestorm unlike anything seen before. Major news outlets rushed to publish articles, bold headlines screaming, "Battlefield hero assaulted in courtroom justice, trampled before the camera." Images of Naomi with blood at her mouth became instant symbols, flooding social media. Major TV networks broke regular programming to replay the footage, and even international channels picked it up, turning the story into a global event. Among veteran communities, the fury ran deeper than anywhere else. Open letters signed by thousands declared that they would not stay silent while a fellow soldier was humiliated by those in power. Videos began circulating showing veterans in old uniforms, hands over their hearts, proclaiming Naomi is not alone. For them, this was no longer about one person, but the honor of an entire community that once risked everything on the battlefield. On college campuses, students held emergency forums and lecture halls usually filled with dry lessons, echoed instead with chants of justice for Naomi. On the streets, hastily drawn posters were taped to poles and walls, the scrawled words burning with urgency, "Respect Marines." Activist groups mobilized across social platforms, calling for marches and raising their voices, turning anger into movement. The social media storm didn't stop at outrage. It reached deep into the fears of those in power. Politicians scrambled to release statements promising to monitor the case, pledging demands for independent investigations. But the public no longer accepted hollow words. Every comment fired back with sharp demands. "We want justice, not empty promises." Rick Halper became the center of public outrage, his tied to degrading hashtags, his image mocked and spread across the internet. Meanwhile, General Thomas Grant was hailed as a symbol of integrity, his image standing in front of Naomi, reprinted thousands of times alongside the quote, "No one has the right to lay a hand on my warrior." Naomi, once a prisoner publicly humiliated, suddenly became a banner recognized by an entire society, representing those pushed to the bottom by abusive power. An entire nation seemed to wake up that night as the video tore through the veil of silence that had been carefully maintained for years. And in the roaring current of millions of views and voices, a true storm had begun, one sparked by the blood at the corner of Naomi's mouth, by eyes that refused to fall, and by the moment truth was laid bare before all. Secondary videos continued to spread, capturing not only the slap in the courtroom but also the commanding words of General Thomas Grant. In the midst of that wave, the veteran community appeared in force, refusing to stay silent while one of their own was dishonored. Clips filmed by veterans themselves in faded uniforms or plain shirts that still carried strength flooded social media. A gray-haired man with a hoarse voice pointed into the camera and declared, "Naomi Carter is never alone. She protected us. Now it's our turn to protect her." Behind him, others stood in line, hands over hearts, eyes sharp, as if returned to the moment they first took their oath under the flag. That support ignited a new wave, pushing the original video into further viral reach. Viewers saw not only Naomi's steady presence, but also veterans across generations publicly pledging allegiance to her. A group of recently discharged soldiers shared a clip filmed on an empty field, the whole unit lined up saluting in unison, shouting justice for Naomi. Elsewhere, a man in a wheelchair, his face carved by time and war, declared firmly that slap was a slap to all of us. Justice must be restored. These images were continuously edited into one powerful stream, a long emotional sequence that became a fierce weapon against abusive power. The overwhelming presence of veterans lit the public sphere on fire. They were not just individuals speaking up, they were living emblems of honor and loyalty to the nation. When they stood beside Naomi, society immediately understood this was no longer about one person, but a matter that touched the core of trust. The oaths echoing across social media were shared millions of times, each sentence, each image a reminder that justice could not be buried within the four walls of a courtroom. Faced with the storm, the city's police chief was forced to make an appearance. He hastily held a press conference the very next morning, his face visibly tense. The room was packed with reporters, camera flashes going off, non-stop microphones stacked across the wooden podium. The chief began in a tone attempting to stay composed. "We are aware of the situation, and an internal investigation will be conducted." But his words were far from enough to calm public outrage. Questions erupted instantly, reporters pressing without pause. How could a police officer slap a witness in court? Why didn't the judge intervene? Is Naomi Carter safe and being protected? Sweat beaded on his forehead as the chief tried to explain that the matter was still under review, that no conclusion could be drawn yet. But his voice trembled, lacking the conviction that the moment demanded. Meanwhile, images of veterans raising their hands in solemn pledge to protect Naomi continued to stream across millions of phone screens. The public was out of patience, demanding clarity, not vague reassurances. The press conference ended in chaos, the room sweltering with tension as reporters chased after the chief for more answers. Outside, a crowd had gathered in front of police headquarters, holding posters, shouting chants. The wave of outrage had spilled out from the digital world, turning into real pressure. And in that storm, the image of Naomi Carter, with blood on her lip but fire in her eyes, remained at the center, a flame continuously fed by the hearts of millions aching for justice. As morning sunlight barely broke the horizon, major television networks simultaneously broadcast a short clip showing General Thomas Grant unlocking the handcuffs from Naomi Carter's wrists. That image flooded cafes, subway stations, and the living rooms of millions of households. People watched in silence as the four-star general stood tall in the courtroom, his deep voice declaring, "No one has the right to lay a hand on my warrior." The event had long outgrown the boundaries of a trial. It had become a shockwave reverberating across the entire nation. Breaking news segments opened with grave commentary, and many journalists called it the most severe collapse of public trust in authority in recent years. From major cities, crowds poured into the streets, the atmosphere swelling like a surging tide. In front of police headquarters, posters rose high, the phrase, "Respect Marines," echoing in unison. The chants followed the rhythm of drums, loud and relentless. Protesters came from all walks of life, students in school uniforms, laborers in work clothes, veterans in faded military jackets. They raised their voices and slogans together, a collective reminder that national pride cannot be trampled. International media outlets quickly picked up the story, and images of the protests made their way into foreign evening news. Analysts called it a crisis of honor, as the public no longer saw Naomi Carter as merely an abused woman but a symbol of forsaken warriors. Every chant outside police stations carried fury. Every poster stood as evidence that society would not tolerate silence. Inside government circles, pressure mounted rapidly. Officials scrambled to convene emergency meetings debating how to contain the outrage. Some pushed for an immediate investigation into Rick Halper, while others warned that inaction could drive the entire system toward collapse. Lawmakers appeared on TV, faces tense, promising to call for hearings. But no promise could stop the storm now sweeping through the streets. On college campuses, student groups set up tents, bringing loudspeakers to replay the video of General Grant unfastening the cuffs for every passerby to see. Applause and cheers rang out, calling on the public not to look away. In other cities, veterans organized marches walking solemnly, hands on their chests, chanting slogans as they moved. They carried no weapons, but their presence turned the scene into a solemn ritual, emphasizing that the Naomi incident was no longer a single case. It had become a shared wound. The atmosphere across the country turned into a storm of political and social upheaval. Television anchors used heavy language to describe it, calling it a turning point that would force the system to change. Meanwhile, online platforms continuously updated images of growing crowds outside police headquarters, the eyes of protesters burning with conviction and anger. Chants of "Respect Marines" echoed like drumbeats against every wall, shaking the foundation of a trust that had long been crumbling. And at the center of that storm, Naomi Carter, though still silent, had become an irreplaceable symbol. Her story had surpassed the realm of personal tragedy, evolving into a collective struggle, one where citizens rose together to demand justice and force those in power to bow their heads. The wave of outrage didn't stop at the streets or public squares. It surged straight into the halls of Congress. During an emergency session, dozens of lawmakers rose to demand an immediate investigation, not only into Rick Halper's actions, but also into the entire judicial system that allowed violence to erupt inside a courtroom. Fiery speeches echoed through the chamber, with several members stressing that this wasn't an isolated incident but proof of long-festering decay. Live broadcasts captured the shaken assembly, gavels pounding repeatedly, digital boards flashing special investigation into the Naomi Carter case, letting viewers at home feel the full weight of a society pushed past its breaking point. Immediately following the session, news outlets launched breaking reports with bold headlines. Congress demands emergency investigation into assault on Marine sniper. Naomi's story was no longer just a local case. It had become a national issue, compelling the highest authorities to act. Legal analysts appeared on air, explaining that once Congress officially intervenes, the case must be fully transparent, leaving no room for cover-ups. This meant Rick Halper had no way out, as the spotlight of public scrutiny bore directly down on him. While Congress debated, social media continued to explode by the minute. Thousands of satirical images of Rick circulated, his face frozen mid-slap with captions like "the man who slapped justice." Slow-motion clips of the slap landing on Naomi's face were edited alongside chants of "Justice for Naomi" echoing from the streets, creating a chilling visual impact. Millions of comments flooded in, each one seething with rage. "He's unworthy of that badge. This man made himself an enemy of justice. One slap against a person, but truly a slap against the entire nation." Online news outlets simultaneously published opinion pieces using the same phrase, "the man who slapped justice," turning it into a label permanently attached to Rick. Though he had not yet faced trial, the verdict from public opinion came down faster than any official process. In many places, graffiti appeared on walls showing a clenched fist next to the words, "No more Rick." Outside police headquarters, banners covered the gates, and chants demanding his prosecution echoed louder and louder. Rick became the most searched name online. Every move and detail of his personal life was dragged into the spotlight. Images of him on past patrols were scrutinized, and old accusations resurfaced, further fueling the public's outrage. The label, "the man who slapped justice," turned him into a symbol of abuse of power and discrimination. While Naomi Carter was seen by millions as the embodiment of honor and dignity, Rick had become the face of national disgrace. Under such pressure, the city's police chief could no longer stay silent. He was forced to sign an order for Rick's temporary suspension and announced full cooperation with the federal investigation. But the belated action failed to calm public anger. On the streets, slogans continued to ring out. Veterans still stood in rows with bands over hearts, and across social media, the words "Justice for Naomi" were written alongside "the man who slapped justice must pay," forming a sentence no one could overturn. And from that moment on, the entire nation understood that it wasn't just an investigation being demanded, it was a call for systemic change. Immediately after Congress issued the emergency request, the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped in. The first agents to arrive at the courthouse didn't carry the detached expressions of local officials. They moved quickly, coldly and with precision. Every security camera was sealed, each hard drive and recording confiscated. Courthouse staff looked on, some swallowing hard, knowing that from this moment forward there would be no room to hide anything. Notebooks, hearing transcripts, and every small detail were gathered and examined, leaving no piece untouched. The FBI's presence swept through like a cold wind, clearing away the sluggish air and replacing it with the undeniable reality this was no longer a local matter, but a national investigation. Meanwhile, from an anonymous source, an unedited video clip was sent directly to the agents. The footage didn't just show Rick Halper's slap. It captured the entire interrogation of Naomi Carter. The mocking remarks, the long moments when Judge Wallace remained silent as the abuse unfolded. The clarity of the video was so sharp that every drop of blood falling from Naomi's lip, every sneer from the back row could be clearly heard. It cut like a blade through any excuse, exposing the raw, undeniable truth. The agents sat in silence before the screen, their faces tense, exchanging glances, knowing this single piece of evidence would shift the entire course of the case. News of the video spread quickly, even before it was officially released, and the mere fact of its existence ignited public outrage once more. People talked about it everywhere, from breakfast diners to school hallways, office buildings to bus stops. Word of mouth emphasized that what the public saw on the live stream was just a fraction of the whole. The truth was far more brutal. These whispers turned anger into fire, and no one was willing to accept silence anymore. The FBI widened the scope of the investigation, summoning a wave of witnesses. Courthouse staff, reporters, and even audience members from that day received subpoenas. Many were nervous at first, but as they realized how strong the evidence was, they began speaking, sharing what they had witnessed firsthand. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle, reinforcing the truth that Naomi Carter had been violated and that abuse of power had become routine in the very room meant to uphold justice. The media reported by the hour, turning the investigation into the nation's focal point. Analysts commented that the FBI's direct involvement marked a turning point, signaling that the case had moved beyond the reach of those who once shielded Rick Halper and his allies. On TV screens, footage of federal agents entering the courtroom carrying sealed evidence boxes became a new symbol of hope that the truth would finally be laid bare. People cheered at the news, feeling at last that justice had a real chance to return. In the shadows, the identity of the anonymous witness remained protected, but social media echoed with invisible messages of gratitude for the one who dared to stand up. Many began calling them the torchbearer, because without that video, justice would have been distorted beyond repair. Naomi Carter, once a humiliated prisoner, was now spoken of as the center of a legal revolution. All eyes turned to the investigation, where her layers of filth were being stripped away and long-buried truths dragged into the light. The announcement of Rick Halper's suspension was delivered on a gray, overcast morning, casting a stillness over the entire city. On the news, footage of Rick leaving police headquarters, his face, stiff eyes, dazed but still trying to look defiant, instantly captured attention. Reporters described every detail, from his uncertain gait to the way he clenched his fists, while outside people gathered in small crowds chanting for prosecution. The suspension order was presented as an attempt to calm public outrage, but no one believed it would be the end of the matter. In a rushed interview, Rick tried to salvage his position, mumbling, "I was just doing my job. I was misunderstood. This is all blown out of proportion." His plea came out hurried, unconvincing, only fueling public anger further. Online reactions came fast. Users clipped Rick's excuses and edited them with footage of the slap delivered to Naomi in court, creating viral mockery. Sarcastic captions flooded his photos. Slapping justice is part of the job, and misunderstood really. The more Rick defended himself, the more his image crumbled. Meanwhile, some of his former colleagues remained silent, unwilling to defend him publicly. quickly, knowing that siding with him now would mean being swept away by the storm of outrage. At the same time, the FBI accelerated its investigation and concentrated resources on Naomi Carter. The emotional and physical scars she carried would not vanish instantly, but the official invitation from a federal agency opened a new door. Naomi was now recognized as the key witness in the entire case, and her voice would be the key to exposing not only Rick's violence, but the silent complicity that filled the courtroom that day. A formal letter bearing an official red seal was delivered to the detention center, and a staff member read her name aloud in front of everyone. The atmosphere shifted instantly. She was no longer just a prisoner dragged through humiliating hallways, but someone being summoned to help uncover the truth. Naomi held the document, eyes fixed on the line, declaring her role as witness of record, a wave of relief and gravity rising within her. She knew that what she was about to say would not only affect her, but would also mark a turning point for millions who were watching. In the quiet room, she gripped the paper tightly, the image of blood on her lip that day flashing back, but this time it did not feel like shame. It felt like strength. Being slapped in public had made her the center of attention, but being named the key witness made her the one holding the scales. News of Naomi's new role was immediately reported across the media. On major networks, anchors solemnly emphasized, "The story will no longer be distorted. Naomi Carter, the central witness, will speak firsthand about what happened." Those words ignited a sense of hope in the public. In front of screens, many were moved to tears as Naomi's face appeared, expression firm, eyes deep. They whispered to one another that truth had finally found its voice. Rick sat in a cramped room watching the broadcast about Naomi, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He kept muttering, "I was set up, I did nothing wrong," but outside the public had turned its back on him completely. What he was clinging to now echoed only within those four walls, while Naomi's name continued to rise as a symbol. The FBI's decision to bring her forward as a pivotal witness confirmed that the scales of justice had begun to shift, and this time no amount of pleading from Rick could change that anymore. On the morning of the new trial, the courthouse hallway was already packed. Reporters jostled for position, cameras pointed directly at the main doors, microphones stacked like a barricade. The sound of keyboards clicking, hurried exchanges from live correspondents, all made the atmosphere hotter than ever. Outside, crowds gathered with banners, many holding signs that read, "Justice for Naomi, Respect Marines," their chants echoing through the glass. Passing through the security gate, everyone felt this was more than just a trial, it was a battle for honor, watched by an entire society. Inside the courtroom, neon lights reflected off the polished tile floor, rows of seats filled with journalists. Even the back row crowded with hastily set up cameras, all aimed at the center. On the defendant's bench, Rick Halper sat still, both hands on his thighs, his face pale. The neatly pressed shirt could not hide his fatigue. His eyes, avoiding contact, sometimes darting downward, sometimes fixed on the table. Across from him sat the witness stand where General Thomas Grant had arrived. He walked with purpose, uniform, crisp gaze, firm as if every word he was about to say carried the weight of an oath. The moment General Grant entered the courtroom fell silent. Several photographers began snapping rapidly, the sound like a sudden downpour. He took the witness chair, looked directly at the bench, and spoke in a clear, steady tone. "I was present in the courtroom that day. I witnessed violence committed in the silence of those in power." His words shook the room. Pens raced across paper. Several recorders lit up at once. Rick flinched slightly, glanced over, then quickly looked down. His defense attorney began to rise, but General Grant continued without pause. He recounted in detail how Naomi Carter had been forced to answer manipulative questions, insulted, and ultimately slapped in front of the judge's bench. He didn't use dramatic language, only described what he had seen and heard, but each detail struck like a blade cutting through the wall of defense Rick had built. Naomi sat on the witness bench waiting for her turn, her eyes locked on General Grant. The faint mark on her wrist still lingered, but her gaze no longer trembled. In the moment Grant affirmed her honor in that courtroom, Naomi felt his resolve pass into her. Beyond the doors, the crowd's chant, "Justice for Naomi," matched the heartbeat of those inside. Judge Wallace could no longer maintain his detachment. He sat upright, hand on the gavel but not striking it, his eyes fixed on the general as if compelled to absorb every word. Reporters captured the scene, and many of those images soon spread the four-star general upright, stern-eyed, facing the very system that had once allowed abuse to go unchecked. Rick listened to every word, sweat beading on his forehead. He knew all his previous pleas of innocence had become meaningless because General Grant's presence had turned what once seemed like one-sided accusations into undeniable truth. From the back rows, a few ordinary citizens nodded silently to one another, their eyes reflecting a growing belief that justice was finally returning. The trial continued under intense tension, but the focus wasn't on lengthy arguments, it was on truth being spoken plainly, openly, no longer hidden. Under the harsh lighting of the packed courtroom, Rick was no longer the figure of authority. He had become the one exposed, judged under the gaze of millions. And it was the presence of General Thomas Grant that made this trial different, transforming it into living proof that the honor of a warrior could not be extinguished by a slap. On the contrary, it had become the spark that ignited a movement for justice. Naomi Carter was called. The courtroom sank into complete silence. She stepped up to the witness stand, walking slowly but steadily, her gaze sweeping across the rows of reporters and spectators. No longer the passive figure once dragged before the court. Naomi was now unshackled, her hands resting freely on the edge of the stand, her breathing deep and even. In front of her sat Judge Wallace, beside her the prosecutor prepared to press. But she didn't flinch. When the microphone was placed in front of her, Naomi gave a slight nod, her voice rising, clear and firm. "I will recount every detail of what happened that day, beginning with the foggy morning." She was escorted through the courthouse hallway, and Naomi described every moment. Her voice didn't shake, didn't falter. Each word landed in the air like it was etched in stone. She told how Rick Halper had tightened the cuffs on her wrists until they turned red, how he'd degraded her with crude insults, calling her trash instead of a soldier who had served her country. Naomi emphasized each detail, her eyes unblinking, making it clear these weren't empty claims, but deeply engraved memories. She mentioned the silence of those who stood around that day, describing the isolation that closed in like a wall, letting the courtroom see that the truth was more painful than any wound on her lip. Naomi went on to describe the barrage of unreasonable questions, the forced contradictions, the pressure that demanded she trip over her own words. Her voice slowed as she spoke of her restraint, her hands trembling beneath the table, yet her gaze forced to remain steady. Every word left the room still, because everyone could imagine the weight of those moments. And when she reached the part where Rick suddenly struck her in the courtroom, Naomi paused, her eyes fixed on the bench. She described the sharp sound, the feeling of blood at the corner of her mouth, and the heavy silence that followed. No screams, no protest, only blood and the silence of the entire system. "That wasn't just a slap meant for me," Naomi said, her voice dropping low. "It was a slap against the honor of anyone who has ever worn this uniform." Those words landed heavily, halting the pens mid-sentence in the hands of reporters. A dense silence settled over the courtroom, thick enough that the sound of anxious breathing could be heard. In that stillness, the shaky tapping of a reporter's pen from the front row echoed sharply, hauntingly. That lone sound struck like a heartbeat, slow and forceful, deepening the weight of Naomi's testimony. No one spoke, not a single cough, not a single creaking chair. Those accustomed to the usual buzz of a courtroom sat upright, their eyes fixed on the woman at the witness stand. Naomi didn't cry, didn't plead, she simply told the truth. And that truth spoken with such resolve resolve became the most powerful indictment of all. Reporters kept their heads down, hands trembling from the emotion, but still they wrote because they understood these were not just words, they were a statement that would live on in history. This was no longer the story of one person. It was a wake-up call to a society trembling beneath the weight of truth. Just one day after Naomi Carter stepped down from the witness stand with testimony that silenced the entire courtroom, the military unexpectedly held an emergency press conference. The briefing room was packed, rows of national flags stood solemnly behind the podium, and high-ranking officers appeared with solemn faces. On the large screen behind them, newly declassified documents were shown for the first time, revealing a part of the past of the woman who had silently endured being slapped in court. The military spokesperson firmly stated that Naomi Carter had been a lead sniper in multiple operations in Afghanistan and had saved her unit from ambush on at least 3 occasions. He recounted a particularly fierce battle where, surrounded by enemy forces, Naomi calmly took down each target, clearing an escape route for her entire squad, an act that saved no fewer than 10 lives. The room erupted in murmurs as the revelations completely transformed the public's image of the woman they had only seen through courtroom footage, a prisoner in an orange jumpsuit assaulted in plain sight. Now, before their eyes, Naomi appeared as a forgotten hero. Battlefield photos were displayed showing her in camo uniform holding a sniper rifle, her face dusty, but her eyes sharp and focused. She was no longer the figure of shame in a courtroom, but a symbol of courage forged in combat. National media broadcast the press conference live. On major network screens, Naomi's medals were shown the words Medal of Valor gleaming under studio lights. The spokesperson confirmed her heroic deeds had long been documented, though Naomi had never boasted. She had simply returned to civilian life quietly carrying physical wounds and heavy memories of war. That humility, now brought into the light, moved the public even more. Veterans watching from military halls nodded solemnly, some with tears in their eyes. They recognized a fellow soldier who had once fought beside them in brutal conditions, now facing injustice at home. Op-eds flooded the press. She saved her squad, yet was branded a criminal. A soldier, bearing the Medal of Valor, shamed in court. The wave of outrage surged again, but this time it was joined by deep respect. On social media, images of Naomi in uniform were paired with the photo of her bleeding in court. That contrast sparked shock, prompting millions to share the post with captions like, "From hero to inmate. How long has truth been reversed?" The hashtag #Honor for Naomi trended instantly, with veterans and military families changing profile pictures in solidarity. The intensity of the moment reached far beyond a single trial, evolving into a movement demanding justice for all who have worn the uniform. Naomi did not appear at the press conference, but her image and name echoed everywhere. People began recounting small stories of her dedication in the military, from sharing her last sip of water with comrades to volunteering to stay on the front line to cover a retreat. These memories, once only whispered within the unit, were now brought to light, adding missing pieces to the full picture of a courageous warrior. With the military's official announcement, Naomi Carter was no longer just a witness in a case of abuse of power, but a living testament to the injustice that occurs when society turns its back on those who once protected it. And when the Medal of Valor appeared on screens gleaming as if to affirm her worth, the entire nation was forced to ask itself, how could such a soldier have been trampled so severely? That question echoed across the country, opening a new chapter for the investigation and for the journey toward justice. News of Naomi Carter's military record dropped like a bombshell on public opinion, with ripple effects almost instantaneous. Within hours, footage highlighting her service flooded television and social media, and comment sections exploded. Viewers were stunned, unable to believe their eyes as archival images from the Afghan battlefield were broadcast. They had once seen only a woman dragged into court in an orange jumpsuit, but now they saw a sniper once known among her unit as the ghost of the desert. Thousands of posts repeated the same awestruck reaction. She was a legend we never knew. Many admitted feeling ashamed for staying silent as Naomi was humiliated now, blaming themselves for failing to recognize her true worth. Evening news programs quickly cleared airtime for in-depth analysis. Veterans were invited as guests, sharing how Naomi's name had circulated among units as a quiet symbol since she never liked standing on any podium. A former commanding officer in Afghanistan said, his voice thick with emotion. She wasn't just a great shooter, she was a living shield for her team. His words silenced the studio, and even viewers at home felt their throats tighten. Her accomplishments were no longer just dry statistics, but tied to lives, loyalty, blood, and the survival of an entire unit. As the emotional wave continued to rise, General Thomas Grant appeared in a special interview. He didn't mince words, his voice deep but resolute, his eyes glowing with pride as he spoke of Naomi. He admitted, "She once saved me during an ambush. If it weren't for Naomi Carter, I wouldn't be sitting here today." That statement hit like a hammer, striking the minds of millions. A four-star general, a symbol of power and authority, publicly stated that a female sniper had saved his life. That moment was clipped and replayed across every channel, spreading like wildfire. In his account, General Grant recalled a sweltering afternoon in the Afghan mountains when his patrol unit was suddenly ambushed. Bullets rained from all directions, many soldiers panicked, and the escape route was cut off. It was Naomi with her sniper rifle in hand who identified each enemy position and took them down one by one, creating an opening for the unit to escape. He emphasized that in a moment when life and death were separated by nothing more than gunsmoke, Naomi was the one who kept him breathing. His voice dropped heavy as if burdened by 1,000 battlefield memories, leaving the audience in stunned silence. Public reaction exploded like never before. People were not only in awe, but also filled with burning outrage. How could someone who once saved the life of the highest-ranking general, who saved countless comrades, be humiliated like a cheap criminal on her own soil? That contrast turned into seething fury. Commentary shows called it a crisis of honor, a glaring sign of the system's blindness. On social media, countless posts declared, "If a hero like Naomi isn't respected, then who is safe?" Images of General Grant admitting his life debt to Naomi spread rapidly. People began splicing his words with clips of Naomi at the witness stand, eyes bright, voice unwavering to emphasize the truth, from battlefield ghost to justice icon. Her journey was now undeniable in the eyes of the world. And from that moment on, Naomi Carter was no longer just a key witness. She had become a living legend, a reminder that while truth may be buried, honor will always find its way back. As public sentiment burned with the revelation of Naomi Carter's heroic past, a new wave of information emerged, making the situation even more serious. Investigative journalists, in coordination with anonymous sources inside the police force, released evidence showing that Rick Halper's abuse of power was not an isolated incident. Leaked audio recordings captured him mocking a young black man during a traffic stop, his tone dripping with contempt and hate. Another document revealed a complaint from a Latino family accusing Rick of conducting an illegal vehicle search and hurling insults, but the case was swiftly closed as insufficient evidence. One by one, the disclosures piled up, chilling the public as they exposed Naomi's ordeal as only the visible tip of a long-standing buried iceberg. Major news outlets reported in unison, reconstructing the timeline of Rick's career. They highlighted a disturbing pattern where, at each stage, there were signs of unchecked power and blatant racial discrimination. Commentators stressed that had the early complaints been handled properly, had the system not shielded misconduct, Naomi would never have become a victim. A national newspaper's front-page headline struck a chord, "A tyrant raised in the shadows of silence." The leaked internal police records continued to unearth shocking truths. At least 15 official complaints filed by civilians against Rick had been buried or marked resolved internally. The documents showed that several of his superiors had signed off stamping and shelving reports under vague justifications. Images of case files marked in bold red closed circulated across social media, turning into a symbol of complicity and sparking mass outrage. Those who had once remained silent out of fear now spoke up, recounting their own experiences of Rick's harassment, from being pulled over without cause to being publicly degraded. Each accusation landed like a hammer, shattering the protective wall Rick had once hidden behind. Evening commentary programs analyzed that he was not merely a rogue officer, but a product of a broken system on where abusers of power were shielded by layers of shady bureaucracy. The name Rick Halper now no longer symbolized a disgraced officer. It stood as living proof of the rot embedded deep within the law enforcement apparatus. Out on the streets, protesters held high signs reading, "No more cover-ups" and "Stop protecting racists." The crowd no longer chanted just Naomi's name. They began calling out the names of other victims, those who had once been buried beneath dusty, forgotten case files. The charged atmosphere was broadcast live on dozens of news channels, creating the sense that society was now standing at an irreversible turning point. Rick, now held in a secure facility, watched helplessly as the television in his holding cell looped news segments exposing his past. Each time his face appeared alongside the caption, "Abuser of Power," he growled and clenched his fists, but there was nothing he could do. Once a proud, badge-wearing officer, he had become a symbol of disgrace. No one listened to his weak protests anymore, his voice drowned beneath the crashing tide of truth. In this storm, Naomi Carter was increasingly recognized as the emblematic victim, the one who had torn away the curtain hiding a rotten system. With each passing day, old case files resurfaced, and the public began to understand that the slap wasn't just about Naomi. It was a painful reminder of dozens before her who had suffered in silence and were forgotten. Now that abuse of power had been exposed, there was no path forward except deep structural change. The entire police department was shaken as the leaked files were laid bare by the media. Veteran officers, long accustomed to quiet internal resolutions, were suddenly uneasy as their names appeared on suspiciously approved documents. The backroom handshakes, the abandoned responsibilities once thought buried forever, were now heavy burdens under the public spotlight. From the hallways to the offices, the air turned thick with tension, whispers ringing phones, and anxious glances filled the space. Some younger officers stood stunned, realizing they had unknowingly joined a force tainted by decades-old corruption, while their commanders fumbled under mounting public pressure. Outside, citizens gathered with banners demanding accountability not just for Rick Halper, but also for those who had protected him. When Rick was brought back to court, his decline was visible. Disheveled, unkempt hair, hollowed eyes, he bore the weight of days in custody, and the realization that his name was now inseparable from the word abuse. But what caused the courtroom to erupt wasn't his worn-out appearance. It was the desperate shout that broke from him when he could no longer withstand the pressure. His voice, hoarse and cracked under the weight of silence, cried out, "I was just following habit." The words fell like a dagger stabbing back at the very system he had once belonged to. It wasn't a defense, it was an accidental confession that violence and discrimination had become second nature in his daily work. The courtroom froze for several seconds before a wave of murmurs erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously, fingers flew across keyboards, all knowing that line would be printed bold on tomorrow's front page. Spectators exchanged looks filled with outrage. A few veterans clenched their fists, faces flushed because they recognized that that confession as an insult not only to Naomi Carter, but to every person who had ever fought for their country. Habit. Those two words etched themselves into the public's mind, turning Rick into a symbol of a culture of abuse that had rotted from the roots. His defense attorney frantically signaled, trying to stop him from saying more, but it was too late. That outburst had only poured fuel on a fire already raging across society. News channels replayed the moment Rick shouted dozens of times each broadcast, accompanied by bitter commentary. If violence and discrimination are habits, what has this system been nurturing all these years? The live segment spread everywhere. People in cafes, bus terminals, even in quiet apartments turned their eyes to the screen where Rick's dazed expression repeated on loop. Naomi sat in the witness stand, eyes focused without a hint of satisfaction. She knew that confession wasn't just about her. It confirmed a sickness at the heart of an entire system. General Grant stared at Rick with an icy gaze, as if he had just heard his own command structure insulted. Judge Wallace sat upright, gripping the gavel tightly, his face heavier than ever. In that silence, the entire courtroom felt the weight of truth. Rick Halper had no way out, and he had unwittingly ripped open the veil of protection with those two words, habit. Out on the streets, the chants grew louder. Hastily scrawled signs now carried a new message: no more habits. Slogans spread across social media, transforming into a movement calling for root-deep reform. The moment Rick screamed had turned him into an indisputable villain, and at the same time forced the entire law enforcement apparatus to answer to the public. That day's trial was no longer just a legal proceeding. It was an unmasking, a moment where the truth came straight from the offender's own mouth, leaving behind an echo the public would never forget. The courtroom was packed on the day of sentencing, from reporters who had followed every step of the case to ordinary citizens wanting to witness the critical moment firsthand. Cold, white lights from the ceiling cast harsh reflections on the tense faces of everyone present. From the high bench, Judge Wallace entered, his expression more severe than ever. The sound of 3 gavel strikes echoed, pulling the entire room into complete silence. All eyes turned to him, awaiting the final verdict that would close the long stretch of controversy. Judge Wallace's voice rang deep, each word clear and deliberate. After reviewing the evidence, the witness testimonies, and the truth laid bare before the public, this court finds the defendant, Rick Halper, guilty of assault, abuse of power, and racial discrimination. Pages rustled, but the room seemed frozen. Those words carried the weight of months of tension, of protests in the streets, of headlines that shook public opinion. The statement was not ornate, just cold and final, yet it sent hundreds of hearts in the courtroom into a wild rhythm. Rick sat at the defendant's table, his hands trembling steadily. At the word guilty, his face turned pale, sweat breaking across his forehead. His eyes looked vacant, confused, like someone wakened from a nightmare. But this time there was no way out. His head dropped, lips quivering, as if grasping for an explanation, but no words came. The arrogance that once defined him had been crushed, leaving behind a man collapsed, lost in the very storm he had created. The gallery erupted with long-suppressed emotion. Some people broke into tears, and veterans stood up and clapped thunderously. Cameras flashed, capturing Rick's dazed expression over and over, instantly turning it into an iconic image. The clatter of keyboards and hum of recorders blended into a frenzied rhythm, as everyone in the room knew this was a historic moment, one where justice was not only delivered in words, but engraved in image and feeling. Naomi Carter sat quietly, her eyes briefly closing. There was no triumph on her face, only a mix of relief and exhaustion. She knew this sentence could not erase the pain, but it was a necessary step in affirming that her dignity and the dignity of others like her could not be trampled forever. General Grant nodded slightly, his eyes settling on Naomi, as if to acknowledge that truth had prevailed, and that the disgrace of that day had been answered with justice. Judge Wallace struck the gavel once more, his voice deepening, court is adjourned. The echo rang out, stamping a period on an era of cover-ups and opening a new chapter of faith in the justice system. Rick Halper was escorted away, his steps unsteady each one like a fall into the abyss. His collapsed figure and blank stare became etched into the collective memory, proof that arrogance and brutality must at last pay their price. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. They shouted Naomi's name, raised flags and banners, their cheers blending with tears to create a scene never seen before. The final verdict did not just close a trial. It restored hope to millions that justice, though delayed, could still find its way to where it belongs. Amid the noise, a deeper silence threaded through faith had been restored, and a new chapter was beginning. Naomi Carter sat still for a moment after the verdict was read, her heart pounding but no longer held by fear, no longer gripped by the weight that had followed her into this courtroom from the beginning. As Rick was led away, his dazed expression disappearing behind the door, Naomi took a deep breath and slowly raised her head. Light from the window cast across her face, illuminating her expression, eyes bright yet steady, as if all the burden that had weighed her down had finally fallen away. It was a moment in which everyone present understood that freedom is not just the absence of shackles, but the restoration of the dignity that had always been hers. She sat tall, shoulders back, each breath strong and calm, drawing every gaze in the room toward her. General Thomas Grant from the witness stand stood up. He took a few steps forward, his eyes full of pride, solemn yet moved. In that reverent silence, he raised his hand and delivered a formal military salute, the kind reserved for a fellow soldier. His arm extended, straight hand flat against his temple, a gesture that seemed simple but carried immeasurable weight. The moment froze the room, hearts pounding in step with the silence, and then, like a rising tide, the entire room stood. The row of veterans rose, their faces filled with emotion, and one by one they raised their hands in salute, forming a line that resembled a living monument. The journalists, the onlookers, even those who had never worn a uniform, stood and bowed their heads in respect. Judge Wallace, who had maintained a stern presence throughout the trial, could not remain seated either. He rose, his gaze solemn as he looked toward Naomi. A sacred silence fell over the room, needing no cheers, no commentary, yet powerful enough to be etched forever into collective memory. Naomi turned to look at General Grant. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. Everything was conveyed in her slight nod. His salute to her stood as proof that the truth had prevailed, that every slap, every insult no longer held weight against the power of honor. Naomi took another deep breath, her lips barely moving as if to remind herself, "I am home." It was not a return from the battlefield, but a return to her own self, to the right to exist as a free human being. In that moment, every camera lens swung quickly. Hundreds of photos captured the instant. The entire courtroom stood the moment a black female sniper, once treated like a criminal, was now seen as a hero. Those images would later become symbols shared around the world, carrying a simple caption, "Respect." And in that very second, Naomi Carter knew that freedom had been returned not as a favor, but as an undeniable affirmation. General Grant held his salute, and the entire room joined in reverence, transforming that moment into an unshakable milestone in the history of justice. That day, the city's central square was packed. American flags fluttered in the wind. Thousands of people crowded together, many holding signs bearing Naomi Carter's name. Massive screens on both sides broadcast the ceremony live. Brilliant lights cast over the tightly secured stage. At the podium, General Thomas Grant stepped forward, his face calm, but his eyes heavy. He didn't appear with the aura of a general, but as a man carrying a debt that needed to be addressed publicly. As the microphone was handed to him, he bowed his head slightly, his voice strained. "We're sorry we stayed silent for so long." Those words sent the square into an uproar. Thousands held their breath, then burst into applause chants echoing between tears. It was not a personal apology, but a voice speaking on behalf of an entire system that once turned away, once concealed, once allowed injustice to happen. General Grant Grant paused, bowed lower, his shoulders trembling slightly as if trying to express all his shame and determination in one quiet gesture. In that moment, he was no longer a symbol of authority but a man owning up to his failures. Naomi Carter stood beside him, wearing her restored uniform, hands clenched but her eyes shining. Tears fell down her cheeks, not from weakness, but from the acknowledgement coming from the very institution that once broke her. She stood at attention, holding the posture of a soldier, and when General Grant bowed his head, she responded with a formal salute. That image formed a powerful symmetry, a four-star general bowing before a female warrior once labeled a criminal, and that same warrior holding fast to discipline and honor, answering with the pride of a soldier. The crowd watching through the giant screens fell silent, then broke into sobs. A middle-aged woman covered her face in tears, and an elderly veteran lifted a trembling hand to salute. Children, sitting on their parents' shoulders, asked questions, and the adults answered with choked voices. "That's justice." The entire square joined in a chant. Justice for Naomi, the sound thundering like a storm, echoing on and on without end. Media outlets immediately broadcast the historic scene. News anchors called it a moment of national reconciliation where a public apology didn't just soothe one person's pain, but began to mend a society's fractured trust. Many commentators emphasized that General Grant's humility and Naomi's composed pride were two sides of the same mirror, proving that true justice can only exist when power dares to bow and survivors still stand. Naomi wiped away her tears, her face streaked with them but touched by a faint smile. She knew the past couldn't be erased. The wounds would remain, but this moment marked the recognition she had long deserved. As she lowered her salute, the entire square seemed to stand at attention, with her thousands of people raising their hands in unison, turning a simple gesture into a shared vow. And in that instant, Naomi Carter was no longer alone. Her story had become a symbol, and a general's apology had transformed into renewed faith for a generation. The moment Naomi Carter and General Grant stood together on stage one, bowing an apology, the other saluting in return, was captured from every angle by dozens of cameras. Within hours, the image of that military salute blanketed every major front page from the Washington Post to the New York Times, and quickly spread across international news outlets. On social media, the photo was shared at unprecedented speed, often accompanied by simple but powerful captions, "This is justice." People in distant countries didn't need to understand every detail, but when they saw a four-star general bow and a former inmate salute, like a warrior, they recognized the symbolic power of the moment. International commentators explained that the salute had gone beyond a military ritual. It had become a global language of respect and acknowledgement. It was called an image of healing power because it blurred the lines between authority and victim, between the powerful and the wrong. The world seemed to find in that single gesture an answer to justice movement still unfolding across many regions, that sometimes justice isn't found in long verdicts, but in a symbolic act that resonates in millions of hearts. In cities around the world, giant public screens replayed the moment. People paused, looked up, and silently raised their hands in salute. A group of students in Europe held banners reading "Salute for Justice," mimicking Naomi's posture, turning it into a viral trend. In Asia, several journalists described the event as the salute that woke the world, a reminder that the voice of truth can echo far beyond any border. Posters featuring Naomi and General Grant appeared everywhere, seen as a message that honor can never truly be buried. Academics joined the conversation, publishing essays analyzing the symbolic value of the salute, calling it a vivid illustration that justice demands public acknowledgement and the courage to face one's failures. Military journals devoted special issues to dissecting General Grant's action, emphasizing that few commanders in history had ever bowed so openly before a subordinate who had once been disgraced, and that doing so had only strengthened his credibility. credibility. Naomi became the focus of editorials called by many names the proud soldier, the forgotten warrior, America's new symbol of justice. But no matter the title, all revolved around the moment she stood at attention, eyes wet with tears, but shining bright, returning the salute with all her dignity. That image erased any trace of the prison orange uniform, replacing it with the reflection of resilience, a person who upheld her honor even when pushed to the brink. The event didn't stop at a national level. It was chosen as the cover for major magazines, hung in the conference rooms of international organizations, and became a symbol of justice in a new era. Human rights activists affirmed that from now on, when people speak of justice, they will recall that military salute that captured pain, pride, and reconciliation in one. And from that day on, what began as an act of injustice in a courtroom rose to become a global symbol, remembered as proof that truth can be buried. But justice, once awakened, will echo and spread beyond all borders. As time passed, the impact of the Naomi Carter and General Grant moment continued to spread, becoming part of society's shared memory. Schools across the country quickly incorporated the case into civics lessons, not only as an example of justice served, but as a reminder of every individual's responsibility in the face of injustice. In classrooms, teachers replayed the military salute moment, explaining to students that respect doesn't come from rank or position, from courage and commitment to truth. Many children, learning about Naomi for the first time, wrote heartfelt essays on the meaning of honor and freedom. Her story became a starting point for younger generations to understand that being a citizen means not only having rights, but also a duty to speak up. Universities joined in as well. In political science and sociology classes, the Naomi Carter case was analyzed as a clear example of how systems can fail without oversight, and how powerful an individual can be when standing firm against adversity. Seminars invited veterans and activists to share personal perspectives, allowing students to experience the truth not just through textbooks, but through lived testimony. This ensured the case was no longer a fleeting moment in history, but an educational legacy, instilling in young people a deeper belief in the value of justice. At the same time, lectures on military honor flourished nationwide. From small town halls to large city stadiums, people gathered to hear veterans, officers, and scholars speak. Naomi was often invited to appear, and every time she stepped onto a stage, the entire room stood to salute, as if that military salute had become an essential ritual. The speeches centered on a simple message: honor is not a medal worn on the chest, but how we hold our ground when tested. Many veteran organizations used Naomi's image as a source of inspiration to promote unity. They emphasized that her story was not just about one individual, but a declaration that military honor is an untouchable value, regardless of skin color or gender. Posters showing Naomi standing at attention were displayed in military halls, accompanied by the words, "Respect is earned by truth." That slogan spread quickly, becoming a catchphrase at community events. The media also helped turn this legacy into a lasting memory. Documentaries were produced recounting Naomi's journey from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the courtroom that shook the nation, helping audiences understand that justice sometimes comes at the cost of patience and pain. Interview programs portrayed General Grant not just as a general, but as a man who dared to bow his head and admit fault, thereby elevating the value of truth. These stories reinforce the idea that the legacy of justice does not only reside in courtroom transcripts, but is etched into the collective consciousness as a guiding light. From big cities to small rural towns, people still recall Naomi Carter's story during gathering. It is no longer just a legal case, but a reminder that silence in the face of injustice is also a form of complicity. The younger generation looks to Naomi as proof that even one person, no matter how small, can force an entire system to change. And as her story is passed from classroom to classroom, from one speech to another. The legacy of justice keeps growing, becoming part of the very fabric of society. Since the trial and the public apology ceremony, Naomi Carter has no longer been seen simply as a veteran or a victim of injustice. She has become a symbol of inspiration for millions. The press calls her the flame that guards honor, and her story of perseverance is mentioned in seminars, civics lessons, and human rights forums. Her image, standing tall, eyes unwavering despite once wearing an orange prison uniform, is now viewed as proof that true strength does not come from violence, but from the steadfast defense of truth. When people speak of Naomi, they do so with reverence, seeing her as evidence that even someone pushed to the edge can rise and help transform an entire society. Community organizations and schools invite Naomi to speak, not to retell her pain, but to spread a message of courage. Her talks draw thousands from students to veterans who have silently endured discrimination. Every time Naomi speaks, the room falls quiet, not because she speaks with grandeur, but because her words come from lived experience from someone who was once trampled and rose with her own strength. International forums have also begun to take notice, seeing Naomi as a voice for those who have long been forgotten. Children everywhere quickly embrace the story with their innocent but genuine hearts. In elementary schools, teachers assign students to draw pictures of the hero of justice, resulting in a flood of drawings depicting Naomi in uniform or standing tall in radiant light. On many of the drawings, the word courage was scribbled proudly, a childlike attempt to define bravery. Some children even included General Grant raising his hand in salute, emphasizing that the gesture was not just for the military, but for anyone who dared to stand up for the truth. These drawings were displayed in school halls, moving parents who saw their children being raised on living examples rather than hollow slogans. The movement of drawing and writing about Naomi spread, becoming part of school competitions. Many children wrote things like, "Ms. Naomi taught us not to be afraid," or "Courage is when you tell the truth, even when everyone else is silent." These innocent words went viral on social media, attracting millions of shares and turning Naomi into a role model not only for adults, but for an entire future generation. Her image appeared in children's magazines, educational cartoon videos, and coloring books, planting the belief that justice is real, not a distant concept. When Naomi saw the children's drawings of her, she burst into tears. She said it was the greatest reward because it proved her story did not end in a courtroom or with a verdict, but had become a living lesson for an entire generation. In the eyes of those children, she was no longer the woman in handcuffs walking into a trial, but a symbol of courage and honor. And it was that innocence, those clumsy letters spelling out courage, that confirmed Naomi's legacy did not belong only to the present, but would continue to live on in the minds of today's children growing with them, as they believed that courage is always the path to justice. Following the public outcry over the Naomi Carter case, the U.S. Congress could no longer ignore the pressure from society. Heated debates erupted in the chambers, lasting for weeks, involving lawmakers, human rights organizations, and veteran representatives. In the end, a new law was passed with overwhelming support, focusing on combating racial discrimination in law enforcement. The legislation clearly stipulated that all forms of bias based on race, gender, or background would be strictly punished, while also establishing an independent oversight mechanism to ensure transparency at every stage of investigation and prosecution. This event was seen as a historic milestone, proof that a seemingly personal trial had forced systemic change. Passing the law was only the first step. Implementing it in daily life was even more critical. Police departments across the U.S. were ordered to restructure their training programs. Brief conduct seminars were replaced by comprehensive courses spanning several months, during which officers had to study human rights equality and, most importantly, public accountability. These training sessions were no longer symbolic gestures, but redesigned with the involvement of independent organizations and community oversight, ensuring that no loopholes were left unaddressed. In many cities, police departments were required to publish concrete reform plans. Mandatory body camera systems were implemented with all footage archived to prevent evidence suppression. Commanding officers were obligated to attend training sessions alongside their subordinates, sending a clear message that accountability applied to all ranks. Some departments even invited veterans like Naomi to teach so young officers could understand that disrespecting a soldier, a citizen, is a betrayal of the very values this nation was built on. After years of distrust, the public began to witness signs of real change. Reports on racial disparity and criminal handling were now released regularly instead of being buried. Community groups were granted the power to take part in oversight, building a stronger link between law enforcement and the people. Gradually, patrols stopped being a source of fear and began returning to their original purpose, protecting the safety of the community. Still, reform was not a smooth path. Some veteran officers reacted strongly, claiming the new rules tied their hands and made policing more difficult. Some chose early retirement, while others reluctantly participated, harboring doubt. But under public pressure and the new legislation change became inevitable. Younger recruits who joined the force after the Naomi Carter case brought with them a new mindset, seeing community service as an honor, not a privilege. Commentators noted that this case ushered in an unprecedented era of reform in the history of American policing. It proved that a single act of injustice, when exposed and fiercely resisted, could become the catalyst for systemic change. And when the new legislation was passed, when training programs began spreading, society had reason to hope tragedies like the one Naomi endured would not be repeated. The legacy of justice was no longer just a symbol, but had been carved into law, becoming a shield for future generations of citizens. Rick Halper, once an officer who held power in his hands, became the textbook example, cited in every discussion about the corruption of authority. The media portrayed him as a stark warning that power left unchecked could turn into a weapon of destruction, spreading fear instead of protecting communities. In law and civics classes, Rick's name was brought up as a vivid example of moral collapse, a man who wore a badge but used it to humiliate, assault, and oppress. His downfall became a costly lesson not just for law enforcement, for society as a whole, about the danger of letting power slip beyond ethical boundaries. Photos of Rick with his head bowed in court, his dazed eyes upon hearing the verdict, were printed in textbooks as the perfect contrast to Naomi, showing the thin line between a defender of justice and a betrayer of it. Sociologists analyzed that Rick was not an isolated case, but a product of a system that had nurtured abuse of power for years. For that reason, his downfall served as an alarm, forcing everyone to ask how many more Rick Halpers are still hiding within the ranks, waiting for their moment to turn power into privilege. Those discussions sparked a wave of resolve to cleanse the system, because it was clear to all that without change, tragedy would resurface under another name. Rick became a mirror, reflecting the truth that corruption doesn't appear overnight but begins with the silence of those who witness it. From Rick's collapse, justice found a chance to rise. After years of skepticism, the public slowly regained faith upon seeing someone who once stood above the law now being brought down to face it. They realized that justice was no longer a distant ideal, but could exist when society stood united and the law acted with true integrity. Human rights groups marked this moment as proof that the fight had not been in vain. They declared that justice only takes root when power is forced to bow, and Naomi Carter was the one who had planted that seed of renewal. On public forums, conversations increasingly focused on individual responsibility. Calls to never stay silent in the face of injustice appeared everywhere, as if society had just awakened to the power of a collective voice. Justice, long buried beneath silence, was now spoken of with pride. Large-scale protests gradually shifted into calm discussion panels where people offered solutions instead of just venting anger. It was a clear sign that justice was no longer a fire that flares and fades, but a steady light that could be sustained to guide society forward with greater certainty. In every story told, Rick's name was referenced as one from the past, while Naomi became a symbol of the future. That contrast stood as the clearest proof that justice is not only about punishment, but also about the chance to restore trust. When an abuser of power was brought down and a woman once wronged was honored, justice moved one step closer from theory to reality. And from that point on, society understood that even when buried in darkness, justice always has a chance to rise again if people have the patience, the courage, and the will to claim it. Since the trials and the reforms that followed, the social atmosphere shifted noticeably, and people began to believe their voices truly held power. Where injustice once vanished into silence, now any incident exposed was immediately met with a chorus of public outcry. Online forums, town hall meetings in small communities, and packed city squares all echoed the same message: justice belongs to us. People understood that they themselves had helped bring the truth into the light, forcing the system to bow. That belief spread quickly, creating an unprecedented sense of unity, making each individual feel less alone when facing injustice. In that climate, Naomi Carter emerged as the face of restored faith. She accepted invitations to speak everywhere from university halls and military bases to small neighborhood gatherings. Each time she avoided grand words or theatrics, and with a calm, unwavering voice, Naomi repeated one single message: the truth cannot be shackled. That line echoed everywhere, printed on banners worn on t-shirts and shared as a slogan of inspiration. People saw in Naomi not only a witness to justice, but living proof that truth, even when trampled, could still rise and prevail. Naomi's travels drew special attention from the younger generation. During her talks, as she appeared, many students stood up, eyes gleaming, hanging on every word as if absorbing strength from her voice. Some younger children from grade school sent her handwritten cards with short phrases like, "You taught us not to stay silent," or "We believe in the truth." Those clumsy little letters often brought Naomi to tears, but they were tears of joy, of gratitude, knowing that her life story didn't end in tragedy but had become a source of purpose for an entire generation. National media closely followed her journey and dubbed Naomi the flame that never goes out. Broadcast segments showed her standing in crowded auditoriums surrounded by hundreds holding signs that read, "Truth is freedom." That scene became a powerful image, proving that trust was no longer an abstract idea but a collective action. Each word Naomi spoke was recorded, shared on social media, and turned into viral videos with millions of views. More and more, the truth was repeated like a vow that the past must never be allowed to repeat itself. Naomi's journey didn't stop at home. She was invited to speak at numerous international forums. At every stop, she emphasized that her story didn't belong solely to America, but served as a reminder to all nations that justice must be protected by the courage of the people. Audiences in Europe, Asia, and Africa connected with her because every society carries cracks of injustice. Naomi became a bridge, linking voices that once felt scattered across the globe into a unified belief that justice can prevail when people stand together. Looking back, it was Naomi's persistence and the strength of the community that revived a trust many thought long dead. People no longer saw justice as something distant locked behind political doors, but as something they could claim with their voices and the light of truth. Trust returned stronger than ever, and with it came a new chapter for society where every citizen understood they were a vital link in the chain that keeps justice alive. The impact of Naomi's story didn't just reignite public faith, it also transformed the mindset of veterans across the country. Those who had silently endured being forgotten now saw in Naomi a reflection of their own dignity. At gatherings, faded military jackets and old medals reappeared, proof that their value had never been lost. Veterans groups, once scattered and inactive, became more united than ever, rallying around one cause to protect the honor of soldiers and defend the truth. This spirit turned the veteran community into a powerful pillar for the justice movement. No longer isolated voices, but a unified force, speaking loudly to the entire nation. In many cities, veterans associations organized peaceful marches, raising banners that read "Justice for Warriors," reminding everyone that soldiers are not targets for discrimination, but symbols of sacrifice. They shared stories from the battlefield not to invite pity, but to affirm that anyone who wore the uniform deserves respect. Young and old veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, crossing generational lines to form a proud, united community. That spirit moved even those on the sidelines, because clearly this was no longer just Naomi's personal issue, but a thread binding millions of hearts together. From that unity, a new sense of belief lit up the community. People looked to the ranks of veterans and saw in them examples of steadfastness and loyalty, not just to the nation but to the value of justice. Children watched them with admiration, learning how to salute, while young adults volunteered for community efforts alongside them. The power of community was no longer an abstract concept, but made tangible through every hand held tightly, every chant during peaceful marches, and every flag waving proudly under the open sky. At community gatherings, Naomi's image often appeared beside the veterans, a reminder that she was never truly alone. People called them the Army of Justice, not carrying weapons, but a spirit that refused to break. From small towns to major cities, that spirit spread, igniting a fire that urged individuals to speak up against wrongdoing. In that atmosphere, a new belief took root, a belief that justice can be defended not only through law, but through the unity of those who've walked through fire and come out stronger. That belief continued to grow, reaching communities that had once been filled with doubt and despair. They began to see hope, because when veterans, people who once wagered their lives, stand up and unite, no injustice feels too powerful to confront. That light, sparked by the story of a single soldier, illuminated entire neighborhoods, leaving behind a message. Even in the darkest moments, faith in justice can be reborn when people choose to stand together. A crisp morning wrapped the city in an unusually peaceful hue, sunlight filtering through the trees and casting soft patterns on the sidewalk where Naomi Carter walked with a calm, steady stride. No more handcuffs clamped around her wrists, no more prying eyes branding her a criminal today. Naomi appeared as a free citizen, shoulders back, eyes clear. Each step she took down that street was a quiet affirmation that her honor had been restored, that darkness could not forever hide the light. Passers-by recognized her, some nodding with quiet respect, others offering gentle smiles. Together they formed a quiet symphony of recognition and dignity. Across the street, General Thomas Grant appeared in a simple coat. He walked slowly toward her, carrying not the authority of a four-star general, but the calm presence of a man who had borne the weight of great responsibility. As the two faced each other, words weren't needed. He leaned slightly toward Naomi, his eyes filled with trust and gratitude. Their handshake, though simple, carried layers of meaning. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of what Naomi had done, it was a promise that history would not repeat its mistakes, that people like her would never again be forgotten or dishonored. The moment seemed to still the entire street. Onlookers stood silent, not from indifference but from respect. A few phones were raised to capture it, not with the outrage of the past, but with quiet pride. The images spread quickly, becoming a fitting conclusion to a long journey toward justice. Naomi's hand, once bound, once scarred, now firmly gripped the general's, symbolizing a reconciliation between citizen and institution, between pain and healing. What lingered wasn't the memory of Naomi's humiliation, but her choice to step beyond it. She didn't cling to bitterness or seek revenge. Instead, she turned pain into a lesson for the community. And so the final lesson of this story isn't found in Rick Halper's sentencing or in the laws that followed it, lies in the power of courage. Naomi taught society that the truth may be buried, but it cannot be silenced, that justice may be delayed, but it arrives when someone dares to rise. That quiet handshake with General Grant became a symbol of shared commitment. It showed that justice cannot rest on the shoulders of one. It requires the collective will of a community, of those who once held power and those who once bore its weight. As their hands clasped tightly, the people understood the message: justice lives when we protect it together. The strength of this story didn't lie in courtroom drama, but in the calm of this morning, where a soldier once been trampled now walked freely with pride and peace. From that moment on, the lesson spread, reminding each generation to keep the flame of justice alive, never letting it die out in silence or indifference. Naomi left behind a mark far greater than herself, a spiritual legacy that anyone, anywhere could look to for courage. And in the soft morning light, as the two let go of their handshake and exchanged a quiet smile, the entire community understood that the story had come to a close, but the final lesson would live on like a lantern, guiding future steps in search of truth. Naomi Carter's story did not end in tense courtrooms or with that peaceful morning handshake with General Grant. It continued to grow, written into books and etched deeply into collective memory. Journalists, writers, and those who had followed the case from the beginning came together to distill each detail into a book that not only chronicled the journey of a veteran once trampled, but also served as an honest account of how society confronted and overcame injustice. The book quickly became a bestseller, translated into multiple languages, helping people around the world understand that Naomi's story wasn't an isolated incident, but a global testament to the longing for justice. Its pages captured Naomi's unwavering gaze in her orange prison uniform, the tense moment when General Grant walked into the courtroom, and the instant faith was restored when the truth was revealed. It wasn't just books. Her story came alive through documentaries, educational programs, and even symbolic songs and paintings. People saw Naomi's image on magazine covers, on posters in schools, and in children's hand-drawn pictures bearing the bold word courage. That symbol didn't belong only to the military, but to anyone who had ever been wronged, who had faced injustice, and still chosen to stand tall. The ripple effect turned her story from a personal wound into collective strength, from a private battle into a guiding flame for the entire community. What made Naomi's story immortal was a simple yet profound message, repeated time and again. Justice exists only when people dare to stand up. That message echoed from congressional halls to classrooms, from crowded public squares to quiet neighborhood corners, becoming a constant reminder for every generation. It was written on city walls, printed on T-shirts, shouted during marches, and more importantly, etched into the hearts of those who had once felt powerless against authority. Through her own life, Naomi made that message real, so that anyone who saw her could believe that one courageous voice is enough to shift the course of history. From civics classes, students were asked to discuss the meaning of the story, the responsibility of each individual when facing injustice. Children, who once knew justice only from textbooks, now encountered it through a living example, through the story of a flesh-and-blood person who had been trampled, who had once fallen but ultimately rose and triumphed. Every word from their teachers, every page turned, deepened the lesson that justice does not come naturally. It must be protected. It must be nurtured with courage. Looking back on the long journey, society came to realize that Naomi's victory was not the triumph of one person, but of truth over falsehood. falsehood of light over darkness. The story written into books and turned into a symbol is how this generation preserves the lesson for tomorrow. And when the message, justice only exists when people dare to stand up, echoes everywhere. It becomes a compass for the future, reminding each person that the responsibility to protect justice belongs to no one alone, but is a shared duty of the entire society. Through her perseverance, Naomi handed the world an unshakable legacy, a flame lighting the path for generations to come in their pursuit of truth.